Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me at the back, Joe? Good. That's the main thing. My name is Greg Bamber. I'm a professor at Monash University in the Business and Economics faculty there, and we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting, and we pay our respect to the elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia is one of the learned academies. It promotes excellence in the social sciences in Australia and their contribution to public policy. The Academy is an autonomous, non-governmental organisation devoted to the advancement of knowledge and research in the various social sciences. The Academy's public forums and communications program aims to raise awareness of the social sciences in the community among policymakers, opinion leaders, students, academics, and so forth, and to highlight the relevance of the social sciences for public policy. And if you've got a mobile phone with you, please switch it off. But you may use it, if you wish, to tweet about this or to talk about this event on social media. And if you wish to do so, you can tag this event at ACAD SocSci, or at SocSci Week, using the hashtag Social Science Matters. Have you got that? The Keith Hancock lecture, and it's my privilege just to say a little word about this event, and then I'm going to hand over to the chair for this evening. The Keith Hancock lecture is named in honour of Academy past president, Emeritus Professor Keith Hancock, AO, who we welcome to the audience tonight, especially warmly because he's just become a grandfather. And he was just explaining to me that this lecture is an anomaly because many public lectures of this kind who are named after people who are dead, and he assures us he's still very much alive. And he's a past president and fellow of the Academy, and we're privileged with having, I think I can see at least 4 past presidents of the Academy here tonight. Keith is with his great partner Sue Richardson and Barry McGaw, and at the back of the room, Emeritus Professor Joe Isaac. So it's great that 4 former presidents are with us. Have I missed any other former presidents who are here this evening? Please raise your hand if so. And Keith is one of only 2 Australians who is an honorary fellow of the London School of Economics, the LSE. The only other one sitting in the back row, Joe Isaac. And both Keith and Joe, as it happens, are leading authorities on labour economics and industrial relations, which also happens to be the field in which I dabble. So I can assure you that our students today are still continuing to read your work in this field, Keith, of course. And this annual lecture was initiated in 2009. Academy Fellows are invited each year to nominate distinguished social scientists who might be considered to present the Keith Hancock Lecture. This year they've chosen Professor Ross Homel, who we'll hear more about just in a moment, after I've introduced George Patton, who will introduce Ross. George is Professor of Adolescent Health Research at the University of Melbourne, this fine institution. He's a Senior Principal Research Fellow with the NH and MRC, and he's been an advisor to many distinguished international bodies, the World Health Organization, UNICEF, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, advisory groups, and so on. But rather than me rabbiting on anymore, I'd like to hand over to you, George, to do the main thing and introduce our distinguished speaker for this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Greg. Many of you will have heard of the idea of a wicked problem. Things like climate change, the crazy politics that we currently have in Canberra, social injustice. Problems that have multiple causes at multiple levels and multiple systems. Problems where the solution lies in being able to span and bring together different disciplines, different perspectives, different sectors. Sounds simple, doesn't it? But in fact, it's incredibly difficult. It requires a unique individual who's able to rise above his discipline, above his epistemic group, to look at the world in a different kind of way and bring disciplines together. As far as I can see, our speaker this evening, Ross Homel, has been doing this all of his career. And if you wanted any further proof, he's asked me to introduce him. I'm a medical doctor with a background in epidemiology. So Ross, you've got a very distinguished background. I have some notes on you in terms of what you have achieved. You are the Foundation Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Griffith University, a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, a former Vice President of the Council for Humanities, Arts and the Social Sciences. You led the seminal publication back in, I think, around 2008 of Pathways to Prevention, a publication that really shifted attitudes to prevention in childhood and adolescence well beyond your own discipline of criminology and affected us very much in terms of health and how we approached prevention. Around that time, you were awarded an AO. 2 years later, you were awarded the Selling Gluck Award from the American Society of Criminology. So remarkable achievements. So it's an incredible honor, privilege, and pleasure to be introducing you this evening. You're staying with the theme of pathways. Your title this evening is Creating Pathways to Child Wellbeing in Disadvantaged Communities. Please join me in welcoming Ross to give the Keith Hancock Lecture this year.
Well, thank you for those very kind remarks, George. And you're right, I have striven all my life to do interdisciplinary research and to focus on some big problems. And we're not there yet, though. We haven't solved all of them. So in the time we have available tonight, I'm hoping to introduce some of the work we're doing. And in fact, I need my notes, which are over there in my bag. So excuse me. Definitely better if I have my notes. I want to begin with some acknowledgements as well. I also want to acknowledge our First Australians, First Nations people, particularly the children. So many of the clientele, the populations we work with are Indigenous people and Indigenous children particularly. Secondly, I'd like to acknowledge another contributor to the Pathways to Prevention report, Dr. Jeanette Lawrence in the audience. It's sorry, what was that? Whatever it was, I missed it. I'd also like to thank Greg and George for that kind introduction, which I probably just said. And I did surprise George at drinks by saying I have read one of his recent papers, and it's had a big effect on my thinking. And in fact, it underlies the criminological adage, never too early, never too late. We're looking at a life course perspective in all of this work. So let me move on. I should also just reiterate that this is a lecture for Social Science Week. And I'm going to try and communicate some of the research we're doing in a way. Is anybody here not an academic? Just anybody interested in social science? Good on you. I'm speaking for you as well as all of these other people. Well, probably. Okay, so, while I'm on acknowledgements, my most loving critic is here, my wife Beverly, we've been married now for going on 45 years, so We know each other pretty well, and she is the best person to give a set of slides to, and she'll tell you exactly what's wrong and sometimes what's right with them. And I'm going to take the opportunity also to say that the new Griffith VC is in the audience, Professor Carolyn Evans. It's very good of you to come along. I'm looking forward to having that cup of coffee at some stage. So, what I want to do in this lecture, my aims are threefold. First, make a case that in Australia, we have still not made the leap from what you might call success in miniature, with small-scale interventions that are addressing these serious entrenched problems like mental health issues or youth crime. We do have a lot of successes in the small scale, but we don't have good examples of large-scale system transformation where we can move these things from small scale to large scale. And I know a lot of people in the audience are focusing on that problem. It's a really, really big problem, and I'm going to show you a little bit this evening about how we're attempting to work with existing systems in order to strengthen their capacity to bring science into their routine practices. And it is, as I said, a criminological perspective because that is my discipline and that's the examples I know best. And so I would then want to illustrate a little about the results of some of our recent Creating Pathways work, as well as our earlier work through the Pathways to Prevention project, which came out of that report that George mentioned, which was actually published in 1999. It's that long ago, nearly 20 years ago, not 2008. And finally, I want to come back to that challenge of how we build capacity to do system transformation so that we have a better chance in this country of tackling some of these wicked problems. So let's move ahead with these slides. Yes, I do want the next one. Let's get rid of that. These are our partners. I actually heard Sharon Goldfeld from the Centre for Community Child Health give a presentation in Brisbane a few weeks ago, and she may have had slightly more partners even than this, but this illustrates the breadth of the work we're currently doing. We're working with the Australian Government Department of Social Services, 2 departments in Queensland, Education and Community Services, and the same 2 departments in New South Wales, and a whole range of NGOs. We're very grateful also to the Australian Research Council, who have funded most of the work we're doing, as well as agencies like the Family and Child Commission, who have been very supportive of the development of our new measure of the social and emotional well-being of children. I just want to make one other comment. It's incredibly difficult and time-consuming to maintain these sorts of partnerships, as Beverly will attest. My hair is grey because of the, well, it does take a lot. And I think this is a challenge for this field, that we need to build capacity to do these multiple partnerships in a really effective way. I want to acknowledge the life of Tony Vincent and his contribution to my thinking. I don't know how many of you knew Tony. He died last year. I had the honour of speaking at his memorial service in the Great Hall at the University of Sydney. Tony was a young, dynamic social worker and sociologist when I first went to work in the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research back in the early 1970s. And he had a vision for bringing the scientific method into the study of social problems. And that's where I, as a young, naive graduate in mathematical statistics, actually learned about the possibilities of doing good science on complex problems. So thank you, Tony. And our very first paper together was in the British Journal of Criminology. It was called Crime and Disadvantage, the Coincidence of Medical and Social Problems in an Australian City, which was actually the city of Newcastle. And I've put in the red box at the bottom, it's really just a distribution of risk factor scores. We had about 25 different indicators of well-being in those communities, or perhaps slightly fewer, about 20. And there was a very strong common factor, and I was able to plot that as a young, naive and enthusiastic statistician. And I said to him, he predicted what we actually found, that there'd be a very small proportion, about 5, 6, 7% of the population, where you would have a concentration, a huge over-concentration of all of the problems that were in the indicator list. Well, he was right, I was wrong. I was really a nerd in those days and very, bumptious. Some would say I'm still like that. But it's that concentration of a multitude of social problems in a relatively small number of communities that we're still grappling with. That problem persists in this country to this day. The other person that I want to acknowledge who's been a huge influence on my life was Professor Jacqueline Goodnow, who died now 4 years ago. A very famous developmental psychologist based at Macquarie University in Sydney, formerly from Harvard and other places in the US. Now, I can't claim to have absorbed everything all the knowledge she had, but she made a huge contribution to that Pathways to Prevention report that George mentioned. This was actually subtitled Early Intervention and Developmental Prevention Approaches to Crime in Australia. So it was actually produced by the Department of the Attorney General and Justice in Canberra. And it's been a huge disappointment to me in the 20 years or 19 years since the publication of that report that my own field of crime and crime prevention, and youth crime prevention in particular, has been the least affected by the research and the insights that were published in that report. So we have problems like this that occur in this country. This is probably the youngest boy. This was in Perth a couple of years ago now. Patrick Slater was killed. A 25-year-old, 26-year-old was killed by a group of 5 or 6 teenagers, the youngest of whom was 11. And that boy ended up in the Banksia Hill Detention Centre, the only youth detention centre in Western Australia. And the last I read about him, he still hadn't been sentenced for manslaughter. The others had gone to jail for multiple lifetimes. Now, Banksia Hill Detention Centre. There's been a beautiful, a wonderful, formative study published earlier this year in the British Medical Journal, run by Carol Bauer and her colleagues from the Institute for Child Health Research in WA. They did detailed diagnostic analyses of 99 of the children in that youth detention centre, particularly looking at fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which is a very complex condition to diagnose. And I think you might be able to read the bit in yellow that I have highlighted. 89% of the young people had at least one domain of severe neurodevelopmental impairment. Now, to cut a long story short, that means that they're not only mostly incapable of achieving at school and graduating, they're not able, many of them, without a lot of assistance, to hold down a job or to live a normal life, to participate in our society. These are the kinds of kids, and there's a table that just lists some of the specific domains that were impaired in the incidence or the prevalence of them. This is the first study of its kind that's ever been conducted in Australia. And they found that 36% of these children were actually diagnosed as fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which is the highest percentage in an incarcerated population in the world. So now I would say this has not been done in my home state of Queensland, but I'd say if it were, we'd get figures not too dissimilar to this, particularly at the Cleveland Centre up in North Queensland. Now you'd think that in 21st century Australia, with the technology available and the knowledge that is capable of producing these sorts of statistics, that we would have a sophisticated system of response to these young people. What we actually do in this country is probably best epitomised by that picture that you've all seen. This is an Aboriginal boy called Dylan Voller, actually not from WA but from the Northern Territory. He was incarcerated in the Don Dale Youth Detention Centre, and there was a Four Corners episode, I think 2 years ago now, which led to the Royal Commission into the care and protection and youth justice systems in the Northern Territory. So there is an enormous disconnect between the research capacity that we have in this country to do the kinds of detailed diagnostic analyses of these kids. There's a less developed but still very important knowledge base about how to introduce effective interventions for these young people, whether in detention or preferably much earlier, so that their pathways can be diverted. These children can have some chance of success in life and doing less damage to the community. We simply don't invest in those sorts of programs and those sorts of resources in this country. This is probably the most blatant, scandalous example of the gap between knowledge and practice that I know of in this country. Another of the people who worked closely with Tony Vincent, Peter Norton, formerly of the Jesuit Social Services, gave a lecture in Sydney on Monday for Social Science Week through the Australian-New Zealand Journal of Society of Criminology. The Vice President of that society is here, Rebecca Wicks, in which he basically said we've got to re-examine this whole question of abolition or huge reductions in the use of detention and incarceration in this country. He was a prison chaplain for many years. So there's the Royal Commission. Now the Royal Commission, like all of the reports like this inquiry, has come up with recommendations for early intervention and prevention. But I fear, from what I've heard, the people I've talked to, that the capacity to do the community-based intervention, the reach out to the communities where these young people come from, is simply not there. And I don't see a plan on the part of the federal government to mobilise these resources or to build them. So this highlights the critical lack of capacity that we have in this field. And this, as I said, this is probably the most glaring example of the gap between the science and the reality of routine practice. But if we look more broadly at the impacts of youth justice on the formal system processing of juveniles, to look at that title, that's a Campbell systematic review. You probably have heard of the Campbell collaboration. Its health equivalent is the Cochrane collaboration. This is a rigorous way of assessing the evidence from many studies about the impact of a particular kind of intervention on outcomes for the target population. And this review, in a nutshell, and that's the only graph of its kind that I'll show tonight, that's called a forest plot. And what it shows is that the average effect, that's the zero effect line, that one in the middle, it shows that the average effect of formal system processing from all of these rigorously designed studies is negative. Actually, we increase the crime rate and we do more harm by the use of formal justice processing of young people on average. Now, there are one or two studies in here, if you look at the confidence limits, where they had positive results, and we need to look at why they achieved those outcomes. But the overwhelming message of this kind of analysis is that we are doing immense damage to young people through our formal system of youth justice processing in this country. Now, the bureaucrats know it, and the minister in Queensland knows it, because I was talking to her on Monday at a forum, and they're introducing a youth justice strategy that has real hope actually turning some of this around. So we've got a tremendous opportunity in that state, and probably in other places as well that I don't know about. Prevention scientists, people like me and John Tombaru up there, and George, I think you still count yourself as a prevention scientist, we need to be resourced to work with government and with the frontline professionals to do this sort of work better, and to close that gap between practice and the science. Now, most criminologists, if they're at all attuned to the questions of prevention or treatment, would say, well, the answer is you go to evidence-based programs. And the best repository or list of evidence-based programs for youth and child outcomes and young adult outcomes is called Blueprints. You can go and look it up on the web, Blueprints for Healthy Youth Development. And there's lots of terrific programs in there, like nurse-family partnerships, the Perry preschool program, Triple P, and so on and so on. These are all good programs in the right context. But I just want to repeat the point that putting a lot of evidence-based programs together willy-nilly and throwing it at public servants or at practitioners is not going to close the gap. And I've become aware over the last year or two, or actually the last 4 or 5 years, if I think back, that there's a whole other world out there of very smart, very intelligent, very energetic, mostly young people who are engaged in exactly this problem, but they're not plugged in to this sort of research. And they probably have never heard of the Blueprints repository of evidence-based programs. That's a photograph of Brisbane. I thought I should have at least one. And that shows the new building, executive building at 1 William Street in Brisbane. And the tiny building, you probably can't see it because the lights are on. There's the old colonial Parliament House is there. it's dwarfed by this tower. Now, I was up the top of that tower in February this year at a breakfast at which a lot of these energetic, highly intelligent young people were up very early. I was very impressed with all these young people being up so early. And it was actually a breakfast or a forum organised by an organisation called Impact Boom. Now, there's lots of organisations like Impact Boom that are marshalling energy and resources across different sectors to tackle problems exactly like the ones I've been describing. This is from their website. There was a packed house, and it was, of passionate leaders and change makers coming together to discuss how we might best activate system change. And there were a lot of good ideas, and there was even one academic in the audience. That's Professor Brad Jackson, our new Professor of Policy Innovation at Griffith. And he had some terrific ideas, but there was still, at the end of that morning, a big gap between what I knew the research was saying and the sorts of solutions that these people were coming up with. They had some great ideas. One person suggested, well, the whole issue is a macroeconomic issue. It's neoliberalism and the problem of inequality, which I note the Productivity Commission has just published a report on. It's actually showing that inequality in this country is going up a bit, but it's not too bad and we don't really have to worry about it too much. I think that's probably the message of the report. Not a good interpretation in my view. Others were saying that we need to fund at the systems level, whatever that means. Brad actually made a very important point. He said he pointed out the importance of place-based initiatives, which I want to move on to in a moment, and social enterprises. So anyway, I just want to make the point that if we're going to move ahead in this field of closing the gap in terms of bringing evidence to large-scale practice, we need to make common cause with these people. Now, one of the mobilising concepts that animates this community is the idea of collective impact. We are attempting to achieve or to face this challenge that I've just put up on the screen. The road to scale runs through public systems. A bad system will trump a good program anytime. Incidentally, don't try and Google on this particular quote because you get 58 million, it's the word Trump that somehow distorts the search. This was a quote from a paper by Patrick McCarthy, president of the Annie E. Casey Foundation in the United States. I actually had the opportunity to meet with him briefly in Washington in June this year and have a talk to him about his experience as a foundation, as a funder of huge programs in the US that are attempting to do this sort of thing. And I recommend you read his paper called Inside the Belly of the Beast, which has some real insights into the problems that they face, that we face. But I came to the conclusion that they weren't any further advanced, really, in their thinking in the US than we are in Australia. And I actually think we have the opportunity to do better. And I know there are a number of people in this audience who are engaged in some work that I think is probably in advance of anything I've seen from overseas, or most of what I've seen from overseas. In terms of system transformation, I decided to show this slide because this is something we're grappling with in our own research. The school system, not only the social service system, is part of our project at the moment. And 2 days ago on radio I heard that the Queensland suspension rates have also skyrocketed. In the last 6 years, suspensions of prep kids have doubled. Can you believe that? 5-year-olds? This is an epidemic. You said you're an epidemiologist. This is an epidemic. Which is out of control, and this is another example of the need for system transformation. And there is some good evidence about what we could do about it. But we need to work with both the community services sector and the school sector together in order to tackle this sort of problem. So we need a collective impact approach. I've emphasised building capacity. I'll give you a moment to absorb that picture. Okay, we've got to build the opposable thumbs. We're not going to transform any systems, like a school system, if we don't give teachers and principals and those who work with them some tools to understand the nature of the problems they're dealing with and resources to deal with them. because schools are pretty crazy places, pretty busy. It's not going to happen from within, as we can see with that problem of suspensions. So to summarise the first major point I want to make in this presentation, the challenge facing Australia is to build the infrastructure, by which I mean the tools, resources and methodologies essential for large-scale, sustainable, economically efficient early prevention delivery systems. And I think this entails the twin challenges of system transformation, as I've been talking about, but also community empowerment. Now, Rebecca Wicks up there has done a lot of research on community crime prevention and community empowerment and is fairly pessimistic about it, actually, about the possibility of doing this. I'm more optimistic, but I don't have time tonight to go into too much detail, but we're going to focus on the system, but the community is also very important. I also would like to point out in this Social Science Week that in the 2017 ARC funding round, social science received 1.5% of research infrastructure funding. I always look enviously at the health sciences because your budgets are much bigger than ours. So this infrastructure that I'm talking about, we need to particularly focus on problems in the social and behavioural realms because it's schools and it's community agencies that are struggling with really difficult problems who need help. And that is the focus of our current work. So complex adaptive child problems like child abuse, suspensions, school dropout, youth crime, certainly we need to draw on the insights of that social enterprise community and the social impact people who are very interested in collective impact. But we also need to bring in the science. So that's the unique contribution, I think, of a university-based research team, that we can be those go-betweens. We can help occupy that twilight zone between the world of research and the world of practice, whether it be in schools or in communities or in both. So that's the framework of this work that we're doing currently. And we have encapsulated a lot of our prior successes and failures in an acronym which goes under the heading of CREATE. Collaborative, relationships driven, early in the pathway, accountable through a clear focus on measurable outcomes and shared responsibility for clearly articulated goals, T for training and E for evidence-based. But instead of expounding that set of principles, I want to now show you a brief video, which, if I can find the mouse, I hope will tell that story more effectively than I can.
Let's make a difference. Let's talk about transforming the developmental system. Let's find creative solutions to divisive problems. Let's cultivate conditions for collective action. But first, let's just talk about kids. Every child in our community is on a life path full of possibility. Their journey is one of ups and downs, choices, consequences, chance events, and sometimes issues that are too big for them to overcome alone. It can be a turbulent pathway. That's where we all come in. As schools and community organisations, we travel alongside children and families, each of us bringing our specialised skills to deal with factors like lack of school readiness, unemployment, housing insecurity, family violence, child abuse, and social isolation. We're all motivated, but sometimes it feels like we're not making much difference, especially when we're mired in challenges, like competitive funding structures that pit us against each other, a focus on reactive problem solving at the expense of long-term planning, time and energy lost to red tape, the multiplicity of problems faced by families, and organisational silos resulting in duplication of effort. The fact is, we're working harder than ever, but the evidence shows outcomes aren't improving for many families and children. It doesn't have to be this way. By making smart, small changes, we can bring about big improvements. How? By building a better vehicle, a new framework that allows us to travel this path together. So what should this vehicle look like? Is that it? Or that? Maybe this? let's start with a blank page and really think about what components we need. First up, we need collaboration. By joining forces to address all angles of a complex problem, there's hope we can achieve real impact. But it's not enough to just come together and share a vision. We all have to ensure the things we do reinforce what others are doing. We need mechanisms to keep our collaborative relationships strong, and clear roles for each partner built on trust. This gets us going, but there's more to consider. To really make a difference, we need to understand how problems start so we can develop early prevention strategies. The ability to make change early in the pathway is critical for success, but that's not all. As we mobilise for collective impact, we need to monitor our performance. Are we moving at a reasonable speed, in the right direction? Does the data suggest we need course corrections? Without accountability, we won't get where we need to go. And there's another key component we need to add. For sustainable change, we have to develop the skills and organisational capacity of local people so the community can power itself. And finally, we can't travel in the dark. We need to look carefully at evidence and make informed decisions about which activities suit our goals best. With the right blueprint, we can create a vehicle to achieve lasting change in the community. Collective initiatives are already achieving positive outcomes all over the world. Imagine what you could do in your community. So bring your ideas, enthusiasm and expertise and join us on the pathway to a better future for our children.
We use that video as an introduction to the concepts that underlie our project with the communities, with school principals, with community workers. It's an educational video, it's public domain, and I even had the figures, which I've now forgotten, of how many times it's been viewed. I think it's nearly 1,000 times so far. And I'd like to pay tribute to Dr. Kate Freiberg, who a developmental psychologist who works with us, who scripted that. And while I'm at it, I should also acknowledge Dr. Sarah Branch, who's here from the research team as well, who has another role which I'll talk about in a moment. So moving back here, I was going to spend a couple of minutes talking about our earlier work that actually led to that set of principles of CREATE. We failed, for example, in the Pathways project, which ran for 10 years in a disadvantaged community in Brisbane, to really achieve full collaboration between the schools and the community agencies that were operating with the same children in the same area. We tried very hard, but we didn't go about it right. So that is why the C became the very first principle of practice that we wanted to highlight, the importance of collaboration. But it's harder to actually do than it is to talk about. But the philosophy of Pathways was right, and Jeanette Lawrence helped us in the early days get going in the community with this work. Acting early before problems emerge or become entrenched, that's the E, the first E in CREATE. And it was a partnership with Mission Australia and the Queensland Department of Education. And the purpose of the project was essentially to look at the impact of what I call routinely delivered family support services. This is what happens in communities all around Victoria, all around Australia. There are many, many agencies that are funded by government to provide a whole variety of services for families and children. We know very little about the impact on parents or children in the short term, medium term or long term of those sorts of activities. So that was the research question that Pathways was essentially concerned with. The area we worked in, the orange line at the bottom shows the very high rate of youth crime that was in the area, but it was also very poor, 33% single parents, 40% poverty rate and so on. So, and we certainly know it was a needy and is still a needy community. A whole range of programs were supported and delivered by Mission Australia, including individual support, parent support groups, parent education, sometimes using evidence-based practices like Triple P, but often not, because they weren't available at the time in Vietnamese, for example. It was a very multicultural community that we were working in. 16% of the community were First Nations, 26% Anglo-Australian, for want of a better name, 25% Vietnamese, and a lot of Pacific Islanders. Over the 10 years, nearly 1,500 children participated and over 1,000 families, with 30% of all children enrolled at one of the schools involved or exposed to the Pathways project or program one time or other. And that's just some photographs showing, well, that's a play group, the 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds. That's a parent group. We created safe places for parents to go into the school. Many of the parents that Mission Australia worked with had been so scarred by their school experience, Barry, that they didn't feel they could go through the front door or the front gate. So we created these spaces where they could come with their toddlers and have a play group or meet with a teacher even. At that time, we also developed a measure which initially was called Clowning Around. It's a measure of the well-being, the social and emotional well-being of primary age children. It's based on an interactive computer game, and it's now called Rumble's Quest. This is again largely due to the work of our colleague Kate Freiberg, who's been working closely with a multimedia partner in Vision Media in Brisbane. And that's an example, that's a photograph of a child in the early days playing part of the game at school. School groups can do it with headphones and they can all have their individualised responses to the game. And I'm going to show you a little bit about that in a minute. I'm going to skip the methodology. We looked at we've followed up the early preschool cohort from Pathways in terms of the youth justice records, because that's looking at some longer term outcomes. And there was a 6% offending rate, which was about double the state average of 3%. So did we fail with Pathways to stop crime? Well, we have a fair bit of evidence that despite these figures and these sorts of offences being committed by a few of the children or young people, we had a fair degree of success. All of the usual risk factors were there, which we were able to measure at the transition to high school. I just want to draw your attention to the importance of achievement at school and connection to school as the major risk factors really for subsequent offending. This shows the strategic importance of working between the community agencies and the schools and the families early on. There are sentinel events like suspensions or poor classroom behaviour as rated by the teacher, which are crying out for intervention, for preventative support, family support, which is well targeted. So did Pathways work? Did it reduce crime? We believe it did, but not for all children. Yes, the offending rate for Aboriginal boys was 20% in this particular relatively small sample, but interestingly, those boys offended at lower rates than other ethnicities, which we think may reflect the dedicated work of the 2 Indigenous Mission Australia community workers, and they were 24/7. They were amazing people. Generally, and this is very interesting, the Pacific Island and Vietnamese children generally did not offend, particularly if they'd had the benefit of participation in the Pathways program. So we're seeing impact, but it depends. It depends sometimes on the gender of the child and sometimes on their ethnicity, sometimes on the levels of classroom behaviour that are being observed. So our conclusion is that family support, place-based interventions can work very well. They can improve, we've got a lot of evidence that they can improve parent efficacy, and we've got a new measure of parent efficacy. It's online called PEAM, Parent Empowerment and Efficacy Measure, which has now been translated into 6 languages. But it can also improve child wellbeing, academic performance and behaviour in the short, medium and long term. Now they're big claims, but I think they support a model of proportionate universalism. That is that these kinds of programs that in disadvantaged communities, thank you, that are open to all families are important because it means that all children get some benefit, potentially all those at least in need get some benefit, but those with the greatest need can get more support. So that's the kind of conclusions. Now, we've moved on from pathways to prevention to creating pathways to prevention. Where does the creating come from? From CREATE, the acronym that I described earlier. And you can read about that on the website. And we're working in 9 communities now, not just one. And I've put an arrow against those communities down the east coast of Australia, from Cairns up in the north right through to Sydney, the central coast of New South Wales and some Sydney communities. through the Australian government program Communities for Children, and our aim is to build what we call a prevention, translation and support system using prevention science language. That video I showed you is an example of one of the resources we've developed. But we're working in what we think is a public health cycle, very similar to the Communities That Care program, if you're familiar with that. Coming together, number one, deciding together, planning together, doing together, and reviewing together. And what we're trying to do is build tools, measures, tools, resources, and methodologies that sit at each of those points in the cycle. As a learning, we try to create learning communities within schools and within the communities, which can support the translation or transmission of these methods and tools, which are derived ultimately from prevention science, into real frontline practice. So in other words, the philosophy of what we're doing is to give powerful tools to frontline professionals that can help them with their seeing what the problems are and the evidence, point them to the evidence about what they can do about them. And that, we believe, is going to be part of the process of system transformation. It'll be a bottom-up process through empowerment of the people who are at the front line doing the work. And Sarah, whom I mentioned earlier, is our community implementation manager. She is oversighting the work of people we call collective impact facilitators, who are those part of that go-between structure that we've created between the science and the practice. Their job is to facilitate collective impact by bringing the insights of the science through the tools and methods to the community partnerships that are funded through the Department of Social Services. So that's the model we're working in. It's very complex, but we've had enormous support from all of those organisations that I have listed earlier on. And there's a photograph from last year of the initial training program for the collective impact facilitators. Now, I mentioned Rumble's Quest, and I've got about 1 minute left. I thought I'd just show you very quickly some of the features of Rumbles. Oh, we're still there. Let's move out of there. George, can I have a couple of minutes? Yep. Because we did start late, I should point that out. This was very carefully timed. What I showed you is that video from our project website, the Creating Pathways to Prevention website. Real Well is our portal. It's actually a not-for-profit enterprise that we're slowly creating through Griffith University. It's also a website where we're transporting these tools and resources and videos and so on for general use across the whole world. And it's been incredibly difficult to do this, I have to say. But we're hoping within the next couple of weeks to be able to license the use of we've got quite a few tools now that we think would be very useful. We're certainly getting a lot of inquiries from many parts of the world. We want to license the use of these to produce an income stream which will help us to continue to develop these resources. So that's our business model moving along. So I mentioned Rumble's Quest. It's, is that coming up properly? There's Rumbles and some other resources there. Let's, perhaps if we go up here. Yep, that's better. So the importance of Rumble's Quest, it's not just a video game that measures the social and emotional well-being of children. It is actually an integrated system. There is a huge range of resources in here, from explaining what social and emotional well-being is through a terrific video, which I don't have time to play. Don't worry, George, I'm not going to play a 6-minute video. But it's there it is, Introducing Child Wellbeing. I recommend you go and have a look at it. It really is a lovely introduction to what it means and what Rumble's Quest does. And there's a game sampler in there, which you can download, or a demo. Some of these you can't see, and if I'd had time, I would have showed you this 3-minute video of a 12-year-old boy explaining to his parents what Rumble's Quest is all about and why they should give their permission for him to participate in the use of Rumble's Quest. We're currently, through the Department of Education in New South Wales and in Queensland, making it available over the next few weeks to 350 public schools in both states, in 22 communities and 149 suburbs, which is not bad for an ARC linkage project that hasn't actually started yet. let's just say it's been a tough gig just to get to that point, and we're not quite there yet, but it's going to happen in the next few weeks. So let me move out of this, and I just wanted to show you the importance of this is not just that it measures, the game measures overall well-being, attachment to school, self-regulation, social confidence, and supportive home relationships. This is based on a very detailed factor analysis of 8,000 children that we have participated in our implementation trials in 30 schools. It also measures some aspects of what psychologists call executive function, like spatial span working memory, inhibitory control, and so on. We're not sure how good those measures are because no one has ever tried to transport these tools from the very controlled environment of a laboratory through to mass usage through an interactive computer game. So we're not guaranteeing these particular 5 measures, but we're very interested to see how they correlate and what use schools make of them. Now, the really important thing about this isn't the data, it's not all of the support resources, it's what schools do on the basis of their data profiles. And we're starting to hear some very encouraging stories about how schools have actually they've sat down and understood their reports, which can be tailored to their own particular questions. They can look at individual children as well as, but we encourage them to look at their whole school scores. And one school, for example, and I am going to stop in a minute, actually not in Queensland, in another state, we're very surprised at the percentage of children who said they didn't feel safe at school. Now, they didn't panic, but they sat down and said, now what lies behind that? And so they actually talked to some of the children and they discovered that they did have a problem of racial discrimination in the playground. They also had some bullying that they weren't aware of. And they were able to greatly ramp up their pastoral care program. From all indications, it was a very successful response. Now, they didn't use any evidence-based strategy to do that. It was just a very sensible, careful, thoughtful response on the basis of data. And we want to encourage that. We've got a new PhD scholarship, which is out for advertisement at the moment, where the job of that student will be to look at what schools are doing with their Rumble's Quest data profiles and to work with some of them to actually help them make really terrific science-based responses, those that need it or want it. Anyway, that's the project's a bit more complex than that. Anyway, I'm going to have to stop. I could show you some evidence about what Rumble's Quest scores look like, but I don't think I have time. That's the boys versus girls. And I've summarised, and I'm happy to share these slides with anyone who wants to look at some of this in detail. But it's a skewed distribution, but overall, as the title says, girls do report higher well-being than boys, perhaps no surprise there. In terms of the comparison of Indigenous and non-Indigenous children, interestingly, there's not a lot of difference. Anyway, I'm going to have to stop at that point. Just want to conclude by saying this is just an example of some of the tools. I've talked about 1/100th of the work that we've been doing in this project. We believe this is a useful methodology. John, I was going to show your Communities That Care slides because this is terrific evidence of impact at scale in Australia of this approach. We're aiming through this kind of methodology in a few years to be able to show similar impact across whole schools and whole communities. We think this is a useful approach, and my final slide, which I'm going to move across to very quickly, here we go, is that Australia urgently needs to build this prevention science capacity. You don't have to do it the way we did it. There's lots of ways of doing it, but we should be going to government and to these social entrepreneurs who have some very rich friends and saying we need to invest in the development of these tools and resources to empower those frontline professionals who are ultimately the future of system change. That's where it's going to happen. So we need to strengthen and extend the capacities we have and invest in new kinds of intermediate organisations, especially, I can put in a plea, for the social and behavioural problems that criminologists and educationalists and social workers deal with. And the door is open. The opportunity is here, despite the madness in Canberra, George, despite the madness, this country is best placed to do this work of anywhere I have travelled. we can do it, and I believe we will do it. But we've got to actually get organised together. We need a collective impact approach. Try that, and let's try and make it happen. So that's it. Thank you.